At the peak of her career, Sheryl Swoopes was not just a basketball player. She was an icon of women's basketball in the United States. Born into poverty in Texas, Sheryl rose to become an NCAA legend when she led the Texas Tech Lady Raiders to a national championship in 1993 and scored 47 points in the final, one of the greatest performances in the history of American women's college basketball. When the Women's National Basketball Association was born in 1997, she became the first player signed, the face the entire league hoped would win over the American public. In the Houston Comets jersey, Sheryl won 4 consecutive WNBA championships, became a 3-time MVP, multiple All-Star and Defensive Player of the Year, while also helping Team USA win 3 Olympic gold medals. Not only did she dominate on the court, she also changed the history of women's sports when she became the first female basketball player to have her own signature shoe with Nike, the iconic Air Swoopes that defined an entire generation. For many years, America saw her as the embodiment of strength, victory, and perfection, the woman who carried women's basketball on her shoulders and turned it into a part of modern American sports culture. But behind all those trophies, banners, and cheers was a woman who lived almost her entire life in pain and loneliness. Sheryl had to play through chronic knee injuries, the kind of constant pain that made every morning a battle with her own body. She became a mother when she was very young, at the most uncertain time in her career, and lived under the pressure of having to be perfect to represent women of color and American women's basketball in front of millions of prying eyes. When she came out as gay in 2005, she became the center of controversy across America, receiving hate mail, facing rejection from parts of the public, and feeling even more isolated than before. After retirement, the spotlight gradually faded. The internet began treating her like an outdated name, while many young people don't even know that Sheryl Swoopes sacrificed her youth, her health, and her peace to create the path they walk on today. And perhaps what makes her story the most heartbreaking is that even though time, injuries, and being forgotten have worn her down little by little, she has never surrendered to life. Before we go back to the painful years that shaped Sheryl Swoopes, please hit like and leave a heart to honor the woman who sacrificed nearly her entire life so that women's basketball could have the position it has today. Before America knew the name Sheryl Swoopes as a legend, before the trophies, the historic games, or the bright lights of the WNBA, she was just a little girl who grew up in poverty in Brownfield, Texas, carrying the feeling that she never truly belonged anywhere. Sheryl's childhood did not have the beautiful Hollywood memories that people usually associate with sports legends. Her parents separated when she was very young, leaving behind a fragile family that always lived in deprivation and instability. Her mother had to work extremely hard all day to support the children, trying to keep their small home from collapsing under the weight of money problems and life itself. But no matter how much her mother Louise loved her children, life still left her too exhausted to give Sheryl the sense of safety that a child needs. There were nights when little Sheryl lay still in the darkness, listening to the adults arguing from the next room, hearing doors slam and her mother's sighs full of despair. In those moments, she learned very early that this world is not gentle with weak children. And perhaps from that, Sheryl began to build the cold, hard shell that America would later see on the basketball court. While other children were still allowed to cry, to be hugged, or to be comforted, Sheryl learned to swallow her emotions because she felt that if she fell, no one would be there to help her stand up. Brownfield was a small town where people didn't expect much from poor black girls. No one thought a child like Sheryl would change American sports history. But it was in that loneliness that basketball appeared as her only refuge. The outdoor courts became the first place where Sheryl felt she had value. When the ball left her hand and went through the old hoop, she was no longer the poor girl with a broken family. On the basketball court, she felt like she was in control of her life for the first time. But to survive in Texas at that time, Sheryl had to play with older, stronger, and more aggressive boys. She often got pushed down, mocked, and looked down on just for being a girl. Instead of quitting, that little girl gradually became tough to the point of being terrifying. Every collision, every insult, and every time she was underestimated made her play even harder, as if she were fighting for her life. People who knew Sheryl as a child say she rarely smiled genuinely. Even as a teenager, her eyes always carried a mix of sadness and defensiveness, like someone always ready to be abandoned again. The heartbreaking thing is that even after becoming a superstar, that fear never truly disappeared. It followed her into every game, every relationship, and every stage of her life. Sheryl always feared that if she wasn't good enough, strong enough, or perfect enough, people would leave her just like life had done when she was a little girl in Texas. Perhaps that's why she played with an intensity few could understand. For most players, basketball is a game. But for Sheryl Swoopes, basketball was the only way to prove she deserved to be seen, to be loved, and to exist in a world that had made her feel invisible since she was too small. When she entered high school, the poor girl from Brownfield was no longer like a normal child. Sheryl Swoopes began carrying a quiet anger that even those closest to her didn't truly understand. It wasn't the kind of anger that explodes and then disappears, but a bitterness that had built up over years of being looked down on, forgotten, and watching her mother exhaust herself just to keep the family going one more day. While many girls in Texas at that time were taught to be gentle and obedient, Sheryl gradually learned to live like a warrior. She played ball with older boys on the hot concrete courts, where no one gave a skinny black girl from the poor area any breaks. They pushed her down, mocked her, and laughed when she tried to join games that most people thought women shouldn't be in. But every time she was humiliated like that, Sheryl became even tougher. There were days she came home with bloody knees and red eyes, but the next morning she would still return to the court, as if it were the only place she was allowed to exist. It was on those courts that Sheryl began to understand that if she wanted to be seen in this world, she would have to be stronger than everyone who wanted her to disappear. Those years gradually turned her into someone almost obsessed with winning. Sheryl didn't play for fun. She played as if her life depended on a shot and every defensive play. The coaches who trained her in high school clearly remember that look: cold, fierce, and always carrying the feeling that she was fighting something deep inside. The heartbreaking thing is that behind that tough exterior was still just a young girl full of insecurity and loneliness. America at that time didn't really care about women's basketball, especially black girls from poor rural Texas. Many people thought Sheryl should give up her dream and find a more realistic life. There were even times when she herself started to believe that. There was a period when Sheryl was almost mentally exhausted from financial pressure, family issues, and the feeling that she had to carry too much while still so young. She thought many times about quitting basketball because she couldn't stand the feeling of always having to fight alone. In the quietest nights, Sheryl often wondered if all of this was worth it when life had never been gentle with her, even once. But every time she stepped onto the court, she felt something come alive inside her. Basketball was no longer just a sport. It became the only place where she could pour out all her pain, anger, and feeling of abandonment without having to say it out loud. And it was also during that time when she seemed about to collapse that South Plains College appeared as the first turning point in her life. For the first time, Sheryl's talent began to attract attention on a larger scale. Coaches and scouts started talking about the fierce black girl from Texas as a special phenomenon. But even when she gained national attention, Sheryl still wasn't truly happy, because deep down, she was still the little girl who grew up with the fear of being left behind. Perhaps that's why she always played as if everything could disappear tomorrow. Victories didn't make her feel at peace. They only made her run faster, play harder, and push herself even more so no one could see the cracks quietly growing inside her. But then, right when life finally seemed to be opening up for that young girl from Texas, everything unexpectedly collapsed in a way Sheryl was not prepared to face. When the NCAA future had just appeared ahead, when coaches began to believe Sheryl Swoopes could become something special, she found out she was pregnant. That news hit Cheryl's life like a storm. In one moment, all the years of fighting to escape poverty seemed to vanish completely. She was still too young, had no money, no stability, and was still just a girl trying to learn how to survive in a world that had never been easy for her. What scared Sheryl the most was not just becoming a mother. What she feared was that people would see her as a failure, just as they had predicted for poor black girls in Texas. The gossip started almost immediately. Some said her career was over before it even began. Some said basketball was now just a stupid dream of a girl who didn't know how to control her life. And the most painful part was that sometimes Sheryl herself started to believe it on the nights she lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling and wondering if her future still existed. The days of pregnancy were a time when she lived between fear, shame, and despair. She worried about losing her scholarship, worried that no one would want to invest in her anymore, worried that basketball would leave her forever. But above all, Sheryl feared that her son would have to grow up in poverty and loneliness just like she had. There were mornings she woke up feeling like the whole world was pressing down on her shoulders. While her friends her age were still thinking about school or games, Sheryl had to think about rent, milk money, and how to survive each month. Jordan was born during the darkest period of her life. The moment of becoming a mother should have been happy. But for Sheryl, it came with both love and terrible fear. She loved her son from the first second she held him, but at the same time she felt the future closing before her eyes. The sleepless nights caring for him exhausted her body. There were times Sheryl sat alone in the darkness, holding a crying Jordan, and crying along with him because she didn't know where life would take the two of them. No money, no security, no one telling her everything would be okay. And the heartbreaking thing is that most of America later only remembers the legend Sheryl Swoopes and forgets the young mother who was once so afraid she nearly collapsed during those years. But it was also during that time when life seemed to have ended that something else began to form inside her. Before, Sheryl played basketball to escape feeling invisible. Now, she played for her son's life. Basketball was no longer just a passion. It became the only way for her to save both herself and her son from the life she had always feared. Sheryl began training with an almost desperate intensity. She knew she could not afford to fail anymore. Not for fame, not for trophies, but because Jordan needed a better future. People who saw Sheryl return to the court after giving birth all said she played like a different person, fiercer, colder, and determined to a terrifying degree. It seemed every pain, shame, and fear was turned into fuel to keep moving forward. But deep down, Sheryl was still just a young girl trying not to break. There were times she was so tired she couldn't stand after practice and still had to go home to care for her child all night. There were times she watched other players laughing carefree and felt she had aged too fast, even though she was only in her early 20s. Life had forced Sheryl to grow up too soon, and from here, a painful truth began to follow her for the rest of her life. The more successful she became, the more she felt she had to sacrifice to keep everything from falling apart. And then, after all those nights of despair, after the times she nearly believed her life had ended too soon, Sheryl Swoopes entered the phase where America first had to stop and look at the girl from Texas in absolute amazement. When she returned to the Texas Tech Lady Raiders, Sheryl was no longer the promising student from before. She returned as a person who had been worn down too quickly by poverty, motherhood, and the fear of failure. But those very pains made her even more fearsome on the court. Throughout that historic season, Sheryl played with an intensity that even the coaches found astonishing. She defended as if fighting to protect the last thing left in her life. She scored with the ferocity of someone who was not allowed to fail. And as each game passed, all of America began to realize they were witnessing something special. But no one truly knew that behind those performances was a young mother who was nearly completely exhausted. There were nights Sheryl stayed up until morning because Jordan was crying and then still had to go to practice the next day as if nothing happened. There were long bus rides after games where she sat silently alone because she was too tired to talk to anyone. While the media began calling her the future of American women's basketball, Sheryl was still living in fear that everything could disappear at any moment. And then the game that changed her life forever finally came. The 1993 NCAA Final was not just a basketball game. It became the moment all of America was forced to look directly at Sheryl Swoopes' talent. In front of millions of spectators, the girl who grew up feeling invisible created one of the greatest performances in the history of American college sports. 47 points. A number that left the entire arena silent and then erupted in disbelief. Her shots that night were almost unstoppable. Every point she scored felt like an angry scream from all the years of being looked down on, doubted, and pushed to the bottom by life. When the game ended, the American media went crazy. Newspapers called Sheryl the Michael Jordan of women's basketball. Sports shows said she would change the future of women's basketball forever. America saw a superstar being born. But the heartbreaking thing is that even in the most glorious moment of her life, Sheryl still didn't feel at peace. After that historic game, amid the cheers, cameras, and countless interviews, she still carried a feeling of exhaustion that made her feel like she was about to collapse. Some people said that after everything ended, Sheryl sat alone and cried because she was so tired. Not the happy Hollywood-style tears, but the tears of someone who had forced herself to endure for too long. Her whole body ached. Her mind spun from lack of sleep and pressure. But the next morning, America only saw the smile of a new legend. No one saw the young woman who was afraid about money, about her son, and about whether she had enough strength to continue living in this increasingly harsh cycle. That was perhaps one of the saddest things in Sheryl Swoopes' story. The more successful she became, the more she had to hide her pain. When America saw an icon rising, Sheryl saw an exhausted woman trying not to let life defeat her again. And from that moment, American women's basketball began placing a weight on her shoulders that no one her age should have to bear, because from now on, Sheryl was no longer playing just for herself. She was about to become the hope for an entire sport that desperately needed someone great enough to make America believe that women's basketball deserved to exist. After that historic night, Sheryl Swoopes' life changed at a speed that even she couldn't keep up with. In a short time, the girl who once feared being forgotten in Texas suddenly became the name all of America began mentioning as the greatest hope for women's basketball. But the heartbreaking thing is that while the world saw a dream coming true, Sheryl began stepping into the loneliest and most pressured period of her life. When the Women's National Basketball Association officially launched 1997, the league desperately needed a big enough face to make the American public believe that women's basketball deserved to exist on the same stage as the NBA. And they chose Sheryl. She became the first player in WNBA history to sign a contract with the league, a decision so symbolic that it nearly placed the entire future of women's basketball on the shoulders of a woman who hadn't even had time to heal the wounds in her own life. The media began calling her the face of the league. Giant posters of Sheryl's face appeared everywhere. Television shows constantly featured her as the perfect embodiment of modern American women's basketball. Strong, talented, smart, and unbeatable. But behind all that promotion was a person who was exhausted every day. Because from then on, Sheryl was almost no longer allowed to be weak. She not only had to win games, she had to make all of America love women's basketball. And what made that pressure even more cruel was that Sheryl understood very well that if she failed, many people would use it to say women didn't deserve their own league. In the eyes of the public, Sheryl gradually became the perfect icon. But the reality behind the spotlight was completely different. She constantly traveled between cities, living on planes, in hotels, and arenas with packed schedules. There were weeks when she barely knew which state she was in. Training sessions followed games, then continued with promotional events, interviews, and commercial shoots. While the NBA had a huge support system, the early WNBA basically forced female players to carry themselves to survive. But Sheryl never allowed herself to complain publicly, perhaps because she knew too many people were looking at her as the foundation for the future of an entire sport. Then everything became even bigger when Nike signed her to a signature shoe deal. The Air Swoopes was not just a pair of basketball shoes. It became a historic moment for women in American sports. For the first time, a female basketball player had her own shoe line, like male NBA superstars. For millions of young girls, Sheryl Swoopes was no longer just an athlete. She became proof that women could also become global commercial icons. But what America saw was success. What they didn't see was the price of that success. The years of playing at a terrifying intensity began to destroy Sheryl's body. Her knees hurt more after every season. There were mornings when she could barely get out of bed without wincing. Back pain and mental exhaustion gradually became a constant part of her life. But she still continued to play, not because she wasn't in pain, but because Sheryl felt she didn't have the right to stop. Too many people were placing their hopes in her, and that was perhaps the most tragic thing in this period of Sheryl Swoopes' life. The whole world needed her to be strong, but almost no one asked if she was okay. People wanted her to be the perfect role model for women's basketball, for women of color, and for the younger generation of America. But behind all that praise was a woman who was becoming increasingly lonely. Her personal life almost completely disappeared between flights and dense game schedules. There were nights when Sheryl returned to her hotel room after a game, lay still in the darkness with aching knees and a suffocating emptiness. The cheers of tens of thousands of fans from a few hours earlier were now replaced by silence. And in those moments she began to realize a painful truth. The more she became a legend, the less she was allowed to be a normal person. But even as her body began to decline and her spirit grew more tired, Sheryl continued to fight. Because deep down, the little girl who grew up with the fear of abandonment in Texas still believed that if she stopped being strong even once, everything she had sacrificed to build would collapse completely. In the late 1990s, as the Houston Comets began building the first dynasty of the WNBA, Sheryl Swoopes seemed to have become exactly what America always wanted in a sports icon. She kept winning. Trophies followed one after another, arenas became more and more packed. The media called the Houston Comets the dynasty of women's basketball and Sheryl the soul of that entire empire. On television, she appeared with a confident smile, perfect shots, and the image of a champion who was almost unbeatable. For millions of young girls across America, Sheryl was no longer just a basketball player. She was proof that women could also dominate professional sports, could become legends, and could make the whole country admire them. But what few realized was that each championship took away another part of her remaining health and peace. While the public saw the Houston Comets as a sports fairy tale, inside that winning machine, Sheryl was gradually becoming exhausted both physically and mentally. Her knee injuries began appearing more frequently after each season. At first, they were just small pains after games. But over time, they turned into persistent pain that made her almost forget what it felt like to have a completely healthy body. There were nights after games when Sheryl had to sit for hours with ice packs on her knees in a cold hotel room while the rest of the world only saw highlights and trophies. There were mornings she woke up with a body in so much pain she didn't want to get out of bed, but a few hours later, she still had to go to the court with a strong face, as if nothing had happened. And the more she won, the more cruel the pressure to be perfect became. Sheryl was no longer allowed to have bad games, not allowed to be weak, not allowed to be tired. She no longer represented just the Houston Comets. She represented all of women's basketball in the United States. Every time she stepped on the court, the entire league seemed to be betting on whether American fans would continue to believe in the WNBA. The heartbreaking thing is that behind those victories, Sheryl felt more and more lonely. Silent conflicts within the team began to appear as the pressure to win increased each year. In sports dynasties, success often hides a lot of damage underneath, and the Houston Comets were no different. Tension, exhaustion, and media pressure made relationships within the team increasingly complicated. There were times Sheryl felt isolated even within the collective she had helped build. She became the biggest, most famous face, and also the one who had to carry the most expectations. But the more she was seen as an icon, the harder it was to find anyone who truly understood how much pain she was in. Perhaps the most tragic thing in this period was that basketball began to take away the very thing that had once saved Sheryl. When she was young, basketball was the place that made her feel she had value. But now, that sport gradually turned into a machine crushing her body and spirit day by day. Her personal life almost completely disappeared. Flights, hotels, practices, and games followed one after another to the point she no longer knew what real rest was. There were nights after winning when the whole team celebrated, but Sheryl only wanted to be alone in the darkness because she was too tired to continue playing the role of the strong woman the world expected. And deep down, the fear of abandonment from childhood had still never disappeared. It made her always feel she had to keep winning to deserve love and recognition. That was why Sheryl pushed herself to play even when her body was sending out cries for help. She feared that if she stopped even once, everything would collapse. The championship trophies kept coming. The Houston Comets continued to become a historic WNBA dynasty, and America continued to see Sheryl Swoopes as an unbeatable superhero. But no one saw the woman who was gradually losing her peace, her health, and even the feeling of being a normal person. And from here, her life began to enter battles far more painful than any opponent on the basketball court. But even when all of America began to see Sheryl Swoopes as the perfect embodiment of strength and victory, inside her another war was happening that was even more painful than all the injuries on the court. For many years, Sheryl lived with the feeling that she was split into two completely different people. One was the WNBA icon, the face representing American women's basketball, the woman who always appeared strong in front of cameras and was expected to be the perfect role model for millions of young girls. The other was the real person she almost didn't dare let anyone see. The late 1990s and early 2000s were the period when Sheryl began to sink deep into identity conflict and endless fear. She understood how big her position was in American sports. And precisely because of that, she was even more afraid that the truth about herself could destroy everything. In that era, American society was still full of prejudice against LGBTQ athletes, especially a black woman holding a national icon role like Sheryl. She knew that if just one truth came out, everything could change forever. The endorsement contracts, the praises, the perfect role model position that the entire WNBA tried to build around her, all of it could disappear. Perhaps the most painful thing was that Sheryl began to live like someone who was not allowed to be herself. The most important relationships in her life had to exist in silence. Her true emotions had to be hidden behind the cold image the public was familiar with. She always lived in a state of alertness, always afraid that one look, one rumor, or one article could make her life collapse. In the eyes of the media, Sheryl was a tireless, strong woman. But in reality, she became increasingly exhausted from having to constantly hide her true self. There were nights after games, when the entire arena had turned off the lights and her teammates returned to their families or private lives. Sheryl would lie alone in the cold hotel room, staring at the ceiling in absolute silence. The steady hum of the air conditioner, the dim light from the city outside the window, and the suffocating loneliness gradually became a familiar part of her life. The constant flights, practices, pressure to win, and the need to maintain a perfect image left Sheryl with almost no energy left for herself. The cruelest thing about fame is sometimes not the public criticism, but the feeling that you have to hide your truth in order to continue being loved. Sheryl began living in prolonged anxiety that very few people noticed. There were days she smiled in front of the camera and then returned to her room and completely broke down. There were times she saw others freely living with their true emotions while she felt trapped in her own life. She feared losing everything she had fought for, feared the WNBA would no longer want her as their representative face, feared America would turn its back on the woman they once called a legend. And deep down, the fear of abandonment from childhood haunted her once again. Only this time, what she feared losing was no longer a poor house in Texas, but her entire identity and position that she had spent her youth building. People close to Sheryl at that time said she became more and more closed off. She talked less, found it harder to open up, and always carried a look of exhaustion even as she continued to win on the court. What the public saw was a superstar becoming greater and greater. What they didn't see was a woman gradually losing the peace inside herself. Basketball had once saved Sheryl from feeling invisible when she was young, but now, the fame from basketball made her feel like she was living in a cage that all of America had built around her. And perhaps one of the most tragic things in Sheryl Swoopes' life is that she spent so many years trying to become the role model the world wanted to see that she almost forgot what it felt like to live truly as herself. And then, after many years of living in fear, in silence, and in the feeling of slowly suffocating inside her own life, Sheryl Swoopes finally made a decision that shook all of American sports. In 2005, while she was still one of the biggest names in the WNBA and was still viewed as a national role model for women's basketball, Sheryl publicly came out as gay. For many people today, that might just be a personal confession. But at that time, in an America still full of division and prejudice, especially in professional sports, that decision was almost like a media explosion. Overnight, the name Sheryl Swoopes was no longer only associated with basketball. She became the center of a national debate about sexuality, morality, family values, and the role of female athletes in American culture. Television shows constantly discussed her. Articles appeared everywhere with judgmental headlines. Some people praised Sheryl's courage, but many others saw her as an icon who had betrayed the image they once loved. The heartbreaking thing was that, for many years before that, Sheryl had always lived in fear of this exact moment. She had tried to keep everything hidden because she worried that the truth could destroy the entire career she had traded her youth and health to build. And when it actually happened, the pain was far greater than anything she had imagined. Hate mail began to appear. Some former fans turned their backs on her completely. Some conservative commentators publicly attacked her on television, as if Sheryl was no longer a human being, but just a topic for society to argue about. Some called her a disappointment to American sports. Some said she was no longer worthy of being a role model for children. And for a person who had spent her whole life trying to prove she deserved recognition like Sheryl, those words felt like knives cutting deep into wounds that had never healed from childhood. But amid all that chaos, something else was also happening across America. Millions of LGBTQ women saw themselves for the first time in a major sports legend like Sheryl Swoopes. For many years, they had been used to having to hide themselves just as she had done. And now, the woman who had once carried the entire WNBA on her shoulders was standing in front of the public and speaking her truth, even though she knew it could make the whole world turn its back on her. For many young girls, that moment was not just a confession. It was the first time they felt they were not completely alone in American sports. But the tragic thing was that even though Sheryl no longer had to run from her true self, she began to step into another kind of isolation that was even more painful than before. Previously, she was lonely because she had to hide. Now she was lonely because the whole world was looking at her differently. The people who once hailed her as the perfect icon now began treating her like a controversial topic, and Sheryl understood very clearly that no matter how many games she won or how many championships she earned, a part of the American public would never look at her the same way again. What made everything even more painful was that Sheryl still had to continue appearing strong in public while inside she was nearly completely exhausted. She still had to answer interviews. She still had to step on the court. She still had to play the role of an unbreakable woman while her private life was being scrutinized at a level it had never been before. There were nights she returned to her hotel room after games, looked at hundreds of comments and attacking articles, and then sat silently for hours in the darkness. Not because she regretted telling the truth, but because she realized how cruel the price of living authentically could be. Sheryl had once thought that once she no longer had to hide herself, she would feel free. But instead, she felt like she had just lost another final piece of connection with the world that once loved her. And perhaps the most painful thing in that period was that Sheryl began to understand that sometimes a pioneer has to accept becoming the target of judgment so that those who come after can live more easily. In the eyes of many people, she was no longer just a basketball legend. She became a symbol of a culture war that she herself had never truly wanted to be the center of. But even though she was attacked, misunderstood, and isolated more than ever, Sheryl still continued to stand strong. Because after all those years of living in fear, at least for the first time in her life, she no longer had to run away from her true self. After all those years of fighting loneliness, the pressure of being an icon, and the fear of all America turning its back on her, Sheryl Swoopes' body finally began to be unable to endure any longer. The early years of the WNBA had turned her into a legend, but at the same time they had quietly destroyed every part of that woman's body. After thousands of hours of training, back-to-back seasons with no recovery time, and games where she always pushed herself beyond her limits, Cheryl's knees gradually became the place that held all the pain life had accumulated on her for many years. At first it was just pain after games, but then it never went away. It followed her into every morning, every step, and every restless sleep in the middle of the night. There were days Sheryl woke up and could barely get out of bed right away. She had to sit still for a few minutes, take a deep breath, and then try to put her feet on the floor because her knees hurt so much it felt like they no longer belonged to her body. But just a few hours later, she still had to step onto the court in front of tens of thousands of spectators and continue playing the role of the strong woman the WNBA desperately needed. The most tragic thing was that basketball had once saved Sheryl from poverty, from feeling invisible, and from the life she always feared would swallow her whole. But now that very sport was slowly destroying her body from the inside. The final years of Cheryl's career did not resemble the glorious story the public usually imagines about sports legends. It was a series of days filled with painkillers, long physical therapy sessions, and trying to hide the exhaustion behind smiles in front of the cameras. There were games where she stepped onto the court, barely able to run normally, but still forced herself to play because she was afraid of disappointing the WNBA. She understood the league still needed her name to maintain public and media attention. And just like throughout her entire life, Sheryl once again placed the weight of the whole world on her already exhausted shoulders. The fear of retirement began haunting her every day. For many athletes, retirement can be rest after a great career, but for Sheryl, it felt like standing in front of a terrifying emptiness. Because basketball was not just a job, it was the only thing that had made her feel she had value since she was a poor little girl in Texas. The thought of leaving the court made her feel like she was losing her own identity. Sheryl feared that one day the fans would stop calling her name. She feared that after all the sacrifices, the world would eventually forget her as quickly as they had forgotten many other legends. There were nights she lay awake for hours in hotel rooms or in her quiet house, staring into the darkness and wondering what would be left when basketball ended. The trophies, old newspaper articles, or just a body full of scars and a woman who no longer knew where she belonged. What made everything more heartbreaking was that Sheryl still had to continue appearing like an unbeatable warrior in public. People still wanted to see her fight, wanted to see her smile, and wanted her to continue being the strong symbol of women's basketball. But behind that image was a person who was gradually becoming desperate. The chronic pain made her mood unpredictable. The exhaustion that had lasted for years made her almost forget what true peace felt like. Sometimes Sheryl looked in the mirror and no longer recognized the woman in front of her. The body that had once taken her to the top now looked like a battlefield full of scars. The failing knees, tired muscles, and sleepless nights became cruel reminders of the price of greatness. And perhaps the saddest thing in this period was that, no matter how much pain she was in, Sheryl still continued to play for many more years because she didn't know how to live without fighting. Basketball had become both her salvation and her prison. It gave her everything the poor little girl in Texas had once dreamed of, but it also took away her youth, her health, and most of the peace she could have had if life had been gentler with her. The final years of Sheryl Swoopes' career were no longer a story about victory. They were the story of a woman trying to survive each day while both her body and soul were quietly collapsing. Then the day Sheryl Swoopes had feared for nearly her entire life finally arrived. The spotlight gradually dimmed. The arenas that once cheered her name began to belong to another generation. The cameras that once followed her every step now moved on to search for younger, faster, and fresher stars. After many years of living as the center of American women's basketball, Sheryl stepped into retirement in an almost cruel silence. The most painful thing about fame is that it always makes people believe the applause will last forever. But in reality, the American sports world moves very fast. Just a few years after leaving the court, Sheryl began to feel like she was turning into an old memory that the public no longer really needed. The first days without playing felt like a mental shock she had never prepared to face. For most of her life, basketball had given Sheryl a purpose to wake up every morning. No matter how painful, how pressured, or how lonely, at least she always knew what she had to fight for. But when all the games ended, when there were no more practice schedules, no more cheers, and no more adrenaline rushing through her body before tip-off, Sheryl began to look at her life with a terrifying emptiness. There were mornings she woke up and didn't know who she was anymore, other than the name former WNBA star. What made everything even more tragic was that the first generation of the WNBA did not leave their careers with huge fortunes like many athletes today. People like Sheryl had helped build the foundation for the league. But they did not truly enjoy the financial privileges that modern stars have. The post-career years for many WNBA legends were full of financial pressure, job instability, and the feeling of being left behind by the sports industry after they had given it their youth. Sheryl did not escape that reality either. She still had to worry about money, work, and the future while her body was full of scars after decades of playing. The heartbreaking thing is that most of the American public views sports legends as people who live forever in glory, but few understand that many of them enter retirement with exhausted souls and a loneliness that is almost impossible to describe. During those days, Sheryl began watching basketball from afar, like an outsider to the life she once belonged to. She watched games on television, saw the WNBA growing, saw more packed arenas, bigger contracts, and young stars becoming the new faces of the league. She should have felt proud, and in some part, she truly was proud, but at the same time she also felt a sadness that was very hard to name. A feeling like the world was moving forward without needing her anymore. There were days Sheryl barely spoke to anyone outside her close family. She lived more closed off, appeared less, and gradually disappeared from the media spotlight that had once followed her for many years. The cheers that once made her feel seen were now replaced by a suffocating silence. And in that very silence, the psychological wounds from childhood returned stronger than ever. The fear of abandonment, the fear of becoming invisible, the fear that everything she had sacrificed would eventually be forgotten. There were periods when Cheryl's mental state dropped very low. She began to feel like a stranger to her own life. Her body hurt. Basketball was no longer there to help her escape her emotions. Fame disappeared faster than she imagined. And for the first time in many years, Sheryl had to sit alone with all the trauma she had once tried to run from through victories and busyness. The most tragic thing was that even after everything she had done for women's basketball, there were times Sheryl still felt she had never truly found peace. She had spent her whole life proving her worth to the world, but when the applause disappeared, she began to wonder if she still had value, if she was no longer a legend on the basketball court. And perhaps that was one of the most painful battles in Sheryl Swoopes' life. Learning how to exist in a world that no longer looked at her with the same admiring eyes as before, while deep inside she was still just the little girl in Texas who was always afraid of being left behind by life. But right at the time, when Sheryl Swoopes was trying to learn how to live more quietly after retirement, a new world appeared and pulled her into another kind of pain that her generation had not been prepared to face. It was the social media era, where every word, every expression, and every opinion could turn into a public battle in front of millions of strangers. During Cheryl's peak, sports legends were still somewhat protected from the constant judgment of the internet. But now everything changed. All it took was a short clip, a comment, or a controversial opinion, and the whole world could instantly turn an icon into a target for collective attack. And heartbreakingly, the woman who had spent her youth helping the WNBA survive was now being treated by the internet itself as a villain. The controversies involving Caitlin Clark became the turning point that caused a fierce wave of attacks on Sheryl to explode. As American women's basketball entered a new era with massive audiences and unprecedented attention, every statement from old generation legends began to be dissected word by word on social media. In a short time, the internet turned Sheryl into a daily controversial topic. Clips taken out of context spread everywhere. Angry comments appeared under her name. Younger fans, many of whom had never witnessed the time when Sheryl had to fight for women's basketball to exist, began calling her bitter, jealous, and outdated. The most tragic thing was that most of them didn't really know who Sheryl Swoopes was beyond a few controversial clips on TikTok or Twitter. They didn't see the girl who once played through pain so the WNBA wouldn't collapse. They didn't know she had once carried the entire league on her shoulders in the years when women's basketball was barely respected in America. And what hurt Sheryl the most was not the personal attacks, but the feeling that the people who had paved the way for the WNBA were gradually being erased from history. In the eyes of many young fans, women's basketball seemed to begin with the current generation, while people like Sheryl, those who had sacrificed their health, peace, and personal lives to build the foundation for the league, were seen as obstacles to the new era. Perhaps no one understood how painful that feeling was more than Sheryl. Because throughout her life, she had always fought against the fear of being forgotten. And now, the internet was turning that fear into reality right before her eyes every day. There were days Sheryl saw thousands of attacking comments on social media and just silently turned off her phone. Not because she had no emotions, but because she was too tired to keep explaining herself to a world that always wanted to pick sides and judge so quickly. People close to her said that in recent years, Sheryl lived much more closed off. She appeared less publicly, spoke less to the media, and increasingly withdrew from the noise of the internet. The heartbreaking thing is that at over 50 years old, when a legend should be enjoying peace after all those sacrifices, Sheryl was once again pulled into new waves of controversy that made her spirit even more exhausted. Social media made everything much crueler than when she was still playing. In the past, A bad game would eventually pass, but in the internet age, a misunderstood word could exist forever and turn a person into a target of attack for months. And Sheryl, who already carried so many psychological scars from childhood, from fame, and from many years of living in loneliness, once again felt like the whole world was misunderstanding her. The saddest thing was that deep down, Sheryl had never hated the new generation of women's basketball. On the contrary, she was one of the happiest people to see the WNBA finally receiving the attention her generation had once dreamed of. But at the same time, she was also heartbroken to see the pioneers gradually being turned into footnotes in the history of the very league they had helped save. And perhaps that was the most tragic paradox in Sheryl Swoopes' life. The woman who had sacrificed nearly everything so women's basketball could exist was now being treated by a part of the internet as if she had never mattered. But even though she was called bitter, outdated, or jealous, Sheryl still continued to appear when the WNBA needed voices to defend the league's history. Perhaps because, after all, no matter how painful it was, she still loved basketball too much to completely turn her back on it. Only this time, the woman who had once feared no opponent on the basketball court was now fighting a world where gratitude and memory seemed to disappear faster than anything else. Amid all the years of being judged by the public, attacked by the internet, and feeling like the whole world was gradually forgetting her, there was still one thing that had never left Sheryl Swoopes. That was Jordan. If basketball had once saved her from poverty, then motherhood was what saved her from completely losing herself. Throughout nearly her entire life, Sheryl had always had to fight to be seen, to be recognized, and to be loved. But with Jordan, she never had to prove anything. In her son's eyes, Sheryl was not a controversial topic on the internet, not an icon being dissected by the media, and not a legend that the new generation was gradually forgetting. To Jordan, she was simply mom. And perhaps that was the only place in Sheryl's life where she felt loved without having to win any more games. During the hardest years of her life, from the time she was a young, desperate mother, to the periods when her mental state dropped very low after retirement, Jordan was always the final emotional lifeline that kept her standing. There were nights when Sheryl was nearly collapsing from public pressure or the feeling of being misunderstood by the whole world, and just one phone call from her son was enough to calm her down. People close to Sheryl said she rarely truly relaxed in public, but when she was with Jordan, the toughness she had carried for many years seemed to disappear. Those were very normal moments, having dinner together, talking about basketball, laughing about old memories. But for Sheryl, they were more precious than all the trophies she had ever placed in her trophy room. The heartbreaking thing was that most of America only knew Sheryl through her cold and strong image on the court and never saw the woman who had sacrificed nearly her entire youth just so her son would not have to grow up in poverty and abandonment like she had. Perhaps motherhood was the only thing that kept Sheryl from completely breaking through all of life's upheavals. Because in the worst times, when fame disappeared, when the internet turned its back, and when basketball was no longer enough to help her run from loneliness, Jordan was still there as a reminder that her life was not completely meaningless. There were times Sheryl looked at her grown son and realized that what made her most proud was not the 4 WNBA championships, not the Hall of Fame, or the banners hanging in arenas. What made her most proud was that even though life had crushed her many times, she had still become a good enough mother for Jordan to always feel loved. That was something the poor little girl in Texas years ago had never had. And perhaps that was exactly why Sheryl always protected her family as the final refuge of her life. When the outside world became too noisy, too cruel, and too exhausting, she would return to the smallest and most ordinary things: a family meal, a late-night conversation, a hug from her son. Those seemingly simple things became the rare peace that fame had never brought her. The saddest thing was that Sheryl had to go through nearly her entire painful life before understanding that what people truly need is not applause or celebrity status, but the feeling that someone still loves them, even when the spotlight has gone out. And perhaps Jordan was the only gift life gave to Sheryl Swoopes that did not come with a painful price. While basketball took away her health, her peace, and many years of happiness, her family became the final place that made Sheryl feel she still belonged to this world. There were nights she sat quietly in her silent house, looking back at the journey she had taken and realizing a truth that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The woman who had once carried all of women's basketball on her shoulders was ultimately saved by the simplest thing: the love of the very child she had once feared she wouldn't be able to protect when she was a desperate young girl in Texas. At 55 years old, Sheryl Swoopes still wakes up every morning with pains that have never truly left her body. The years of playing at an intensity that the human body could barely endure for so long now show in every slow step she takes. Chronic knee pain, persistent back pain, endless sleepless nights when her body is tired but her mind cannot stop thinking. There are times Sheryl lies still in the darkness for hours, listening to the silence covering her house and feeling like she is living with all the wounds life has ever left her. The saddest thing is that many people think sports legends live their final years in satisfaction and glory. But for Sheryl, being 55 feels like the period when she has to learn how to live with daily pain without basketball to run from it anymore. The emotional scars from childhood, from fame, from loneliness, and from decades of pressure to be perfect have never truly disappeared. They just lie quietly inside her, silently growing over time. Sheryl still often follows modern WNBA games on television, watching packed arenas, million-dollar contracts, and the fame the new generation is enjoying. A part of her feels proud that women's basketball has finally received the attention her generation once had to fight desperately to win. But at the same time, she also feels increasingly like a stranger to the very world she helped create. Basketball is still the greatest love of her life, but now it feels like a house that has changed so much that the person who once built its foundation sometimes no longer recognizes where she belongs. And deep inside, the fear of being erased from history still always haunts Sheryl. It is a fear she has never fully expressed to the public, but it is present in almost everything she does at over 50 years old. She fears that one day, the younger generation will only remember controversial internet clips and forget the woman who once carried the entire WNBA on her shoulders when the league was on the verge of being disrespected and forgotten. Sheryl fears that the sacrifices of her generation will become small footnotes in American basketball history. And perhaps that is what keeps her continuing to appear, even though her body and spirit are already too tired. No matter how painful, how attacked, or how many times the internet turns her into a target of criticism, Sheryl still speaks up when she feels women's basketball needs to be protected. She still appears at events, still tries to remind people of the WNBA's history, and the women who sacrificed nearly their entire youth so the league could have its position today. The tragic thing is that most of the public only sees the controversies and forgets a very simple truth. Sheryl has never stopped loving basketball. Even after everything the sport has taken from her, her health, her peace, years of happiness, and most of her youth, she still cannot completely turn her back on it. There are days Sheryl sits alone, looking back at old photos of the Houston Comets, the Olympic years, or the time when Air Swoopes appeared all over America, and feels like she is looking at the life of another person. The woman in those photos looks strong, unbeatable, and full of confidence. But only Sheryl knows that behind those smiles was so much pain she never allowed anyone to see. At 55 years old, she no longer tries to be a superhero. She is just trying to survive each day with a body full of scars and a heart that is too tired from many years of fighting. And perhaps the most heartbreaking image of Sheryl Swoopes today is not her knee pain or her long sleepless nights. It is the image of a legend who once changed American sports history, now quietly living in silence, still trying to hold on to her love for basketball, even though That very sport has taken almost everything from her life. When looking back at Sheryl Swoopes' entire life, what makes her story heartbreaking is not just her gradually failing knees, the years of loneliness, or the times the whole world misunderstood her. What makes her life more tragic than most other sports legends is that Sheryl had to sacrifice almost everything so that those who came after could be allowed to dream dreams that in her youth she never thought could exist. From a poor little girl in Brownfield, Texas, who grew up feeling abandoned and always had to teach herself how to be strong to survive, Sheryl became the biggest icon in the early years of WNBA history. But that journey was never like the beautiful sports fairy tale that America likes to tell. It was a journey of pain, of endurance, and of a woman who was continuously tested by life again and again. When she was young, Sheryl just wanted to escape the feeling of being invisible in a world that had never been gentle with poor black girls in Texas. But then basketball took her to places that the little girl back then had never dared to imagine. NCAA Championship, Olympic gold medals, 4 WNBA championships, MVP, Hall of Fame, giant banners hanging in arenas, children wearing Air Swoopes all over America. In the eyes of the public, that was the life of a winner. But behind those victories was a person who had to pay with almost everything. Sheryl sacrificed her health for basketball to the point that her body now carries the traces of an entire war that lasted for decades. The chronic knee pain, sleepless nights, and mornings when she could barely get out of bed are the parts the cameras never captured. While the whole world cheered for the championships, Sheryl quietly sat with ice packs on her aching body in cold hotel rooms. She sacrificed her personal life because of the pressure to become the perfect role model for the WNBA and for America. For many years, Sheryl lived in fear because she didn't dare to publicly reveal her true self. She had to hide her relationships, hide her emotions, and live as if just one truth being exposed would make everything she built collapse. And when she finally had the courage to tell the truth about herself in 2005, the world responded with judgment, hate mail, and even greater isolation than before. But no matter how hurt she was, Sheryl never surrendered. Perhaps that is the most admirable thing in her story. Many people would collapse if they had to live a life like Sheryl Swoopes. A childhood full of instability, the pressure of motherhood when still too young, the weight of an entire league on her shoulders, years of living two different lives, injuries that destroyed her body, being forgotten after retirement, and then the internet turning the very woman who helped the WNBA survive into a target of attack by the new generation. But even though life continuously caused her pain and loneliness, Sheryl still continued to stand up again and again. That is why her true legacy does not lie in the Hall of Fame or the championship trophies. Sheryl's greatest legacy lies in the doors she opened for others. If today American women's basketball can sell out arenas, sign big contracts, and receive attention from the whole country, it exists because of women like Sheryl, who once accepted playing through pain to prove that women's basketball deserved respect. If today LGBTQ athletes can live more authentically in American sports, it is because people like Sheryl once endured public isolation to be ahead of their time. And if today poor black girls in America can see basketball as a path to change their destiny, it is because a little girl in Texas once refused to let life define her worth. The painful thing is that those who pave the way often do not get to live in the peace that later generations enjoy. They have to bear the hardest part of history so that those who come after can walk more easily. And Sheryl Swoopes is exactly that kind of person. A pioneer who had to sacrifice nearly her entire youth so women's basketball could exist long enough for America to finally learn how to love it. There are times the world treats her like she is just an outdated name from the past. But the truth is that modern WNBA would not exist as it does today without Sheryl Swoopes. No other woman was more fitting to become the first face of that league, because Sheryl did not just represent victory. She represented survival. She represented endurance. She represented the ability to keep moving forward even when her body, her soul, and her entire life were in pain. And perhaps that is what makes Sheryl Swoopes' story both beautiful and tragic. After everything she has been through, she has never let life turn her into a completely bitter person. She still loves basketball. She still appears to defend women's basketball. She still tries to keep the pioneers from being forgotten by history, even though sometimes she herself feels like she is gradually disappearing from the world's memory. Perhaps many years from now, people will remember the championships, the Olympic gold medals, or the iconic Air Swoopes. But the most memorable thing about Sheryl Swoopes is not those titles. The most memorable thing is that she never surrendered. She didn't surrender when she was a poor little girl in Texas. She didn't surrender when she got pregnant at a very young age. She didn't surrender when her body began to collapse. She didn't surrender when all of America argued about her true self. And she didn't surrender when the internet tried to turn a legend into a villain. Behind all the pain, all the wounds, and all the years of loneliness, Sheryl Swoopes continues to exist as a reminder that sometimes the people who change history are the ones who have to endure the most pain for history to be changed. Sheryl Swoopes' story is heartbreaking, not because she failed, but because she had to endure so much to achieve the successes that many people today see as obvious. When looking back at the journey from a poor little girl in Texas who grew up in a broken family, having to listen to arguments every night, and living with the feeling of abandonment, people can understand why Sheryl always played with an almost desperate intensity. Basketball was not just a sport to her, but the only way to escape poverty and prove she deserved to be loved. But the most tragic thing is that even when she became the biggest icon of the WNBA, winning 4 championships, 3 Olympic gold medals, and becoming the first female player to have a signature shoe with Nike, she still never truly found peace. The parts of the story when Sheryl stayed up all night, caring for Jordan when she was still too young, and then still had to go play the next morning, or the nights she sat alone in hotel rooms with aching knees after. The glory of the Houston Comets show the real price of greatness is sometimes much crueler than the public imagines. Even more painful was when she had the courage to publicly reveal her true self in 2005. Instead of receiving full understanding, she became the center of controversy for all of America. And many years later, the internet continued to turn the woman who once helped the WNBA survive into a villain in the eyes of a portion of the younger generation. Sheryl's story is a very important reminder to American society that pioneers often have to endure greater loneliness than the rest of the world. We like to enjoy the fruits of history, but often forget the people who had to sacrifice their health, youth, and peace for history to change. Perhaps the greatest lesson from Sheryl Swoopes is not to judge a person too quickly based on just a few online controversies or a few media-edited moments. Behind every legend is always a person who has quietly fought against pains that the public has never truly seen. If Sheryl Swoopes' story makes you feel respect for the woman who sacrificed her entire youth, health, and peace to change the history of American women's basketball, please hit subscribe to the channel and leave a heart as a tribute to a legend who has never surrendered to fate. Thank you for staying until the end of Sheryl Swoopes' painful but incredibly great journey. And see you in the next story about another person who once had to silently endure so much behind the spotlight that the whole world saw.